I call her the muckraker. She's the figure who helps lay the foundation for the modern environmental movement. I give Nixon a shout out for founding the EPA. And I told you guys, EPA and OSHA also have two problems sort of related with them. I'm a huge supporter of both. I think both have a very valuable role in regulations of danger in our country. But at the same time, you know, it comes with the price of regulatory reach. And so if you guys want to hear my philosophy about the world and the country, when it comes to stuff like this, sometimes I believe we share things called the commons. So in other words, those people living in Ohio we just looked at that live in Cleveland along the Cuyahoga River, they all live along that river. So that means it's a shared common area. Nobody singularly owns it. Well, that means it's the responsibility of the government to make sure that no one destroys it for the future and for the people at that time using it. And so I believe that the air we breathe is the commons, right? And so the EPA has a duty to make sure that you and me don't breathe in the pollutants from some business, right? And particularly during this period, you're going to see a lot of toxic waste floating from places like Michigan into places like Pennsylvania or places like Ohio. And so that is very much the role of the federal government to regulate pollution, particularly, some of it was ending up in Canada. The Canadians were getting serious acid rain, you know, from winds carrying the Great Lakes industries, you know, pollution across the Great Lakes. So, you know, I do believe that there is a function that government has in this. However, when a bureaucracy, keep in mind, bureaucracies like government agents, when bureaucracy gets so heavy and burdensome, it impedes success. It becomes red tape, we call it, right? And so I think business leaders have a reasonable argument when they say at times the EPA overreaches, you know, and I'll give an example. As farmers, there was an EPA requirement that prohibited the amount of a type of dust from blowing off of your land onto someone else's. Well, that sounds reasonable, except when you talk to farmers where they have gravel roads and they're using thousands and thousands of acres of, you know, and this stuff, if you live across from a farm, you have to expect that you're going to have some experience with that, right? So I remember a couple of years ago, our congressman got the EPA to change one of the rules. You understand? But, you know, I was thinking this morning, we were talking in my world history class about the FDA. The FDA is the federal agency that required the smoking age to be raised to 21, right? And they did that without a law. They just made a regulation, right? So sometimes EPA or OSHA or the FDA or any other federal agency are capable of making law, even though they're not a legislative body. You understand that? And that's kind of tricky for people because they're like, wait a minute, these guys are unelected and they don't answer to elected people that much either. So be familiar with kind of both arguments about pros and cons of regulations, okay, particularly going into the 80s as we get ready to do Reagan, all right? So one of the things that really, really infuriated some of Nixon's closest economic advisors is the actions he took on inflation. Now, he had working for him, and I feel like this guy deserves a shout out, so I'm going to give him his own slide here. I'm going to show you Milton Friedman, okay? And I don't usually talk about economists too much, but I talked about John Maynard Keynes, so I should talk about this guy because he was a Nobel Prize winner and he was a presidential advisor at the time of President Nixon. So this is Milton Friedman. I'm going to show you his, that's him up close and personal. I'm going to show you his most famous book. And this guy is going to win the Nobel Prize, and he is the intellectual architect of the modern free market capitalist philosophy. So you may or may not know, and this is one of his most famous books that was hugely popular. I mean, huge. You can see it's a #1 bestseller when I put it up here. So it was called Free to Choose. And this guy was an immigrant away from, the totalitarian states in Europe at this time. And he was a reader and a philosophical believer in probably one of the most famous ex-Russians in history. And I want to show you Ayn Rand and her view of economics, okay? Because keep in mind, Ayn Rand was a philosopher, not necessarily an economist, but she was an economic philosopher. And she is going to create a actual modern economic system out of capitalism, okay? And her name is Ayn Rand. And so let me see if I can find y'all. She's most famous usually for high school students as a author of books like Anthem or Atlas Shrugged. So she's very popular, particularly amongst college students, usually men who are free market capitalists, right? She was an immigrant from Soviet Russia, and Friedman was sort of one of her acolytes as what he was also an intellectual giant from a guy named Friedrich Hayek. So in the 1950s and 60s, John Maynard Keynes's philosophy was in ascendance. You understand? He was the guy. And this guy was on the outs because Hayek was a huge advocate for less government and more free market, right? And so when we think about modern economics, it is a struggle between the sort of acolytes or followers of Hayek and the acolytes of Keynes. You know, like it's should the government be engaged in stimulus and in, you know, injection of money and things like that, or should the free market govern? And so Friedman is going to be so popular, he's going to have a television show on. I mean, this is a Chicago School economics professor who's like a Nobel Prize winner, who's not the most interesting who has an enormously popular show and book. So that just tells you how much this debate was going on in the late 70s between too much government and not enough government, so to speak. So I would like you to know, because Friedman is going to quit when Nixon does this. Nixon doesn't do a Hayekian free market solution. He puts wage and price controls on. Like, that's very government intervention. That's FDR, you know. So when Nixon issues wage and price controls, his free market supporters are angry, you know, by that. Like, this is a betrayal of, they consider, Republican orthodoxy. You know, I mean, Andrew Mellon would never have done this, you understand? And so the other thing he's going to do is and this will be the last time, he takes the United States off the gold dollar. And this is it. We've been off the gold standard ever since. So if you wonder what a US dollar is, it is called a fiat currency. And so a fiat currency, let me see if I can pull up the sort of simplest definition. But a fiat currency is a currency whose value is determined solely by the confidence in whoever issued that money. So, for example, I'll show you. I'll put this up. So this is a fiat currency versus a representative currency. So a fiat currency means it is represented by the full faith and trust the public has in the U.S. government. All right. So in other words, are we confident that this piece of fabric and you know, ink will get us goods and services? And the answer is overwhelmingly yes. And that's why Nixon does it. So having this allows us enormously to increase the monetary supply, right? It also means we don't have to have some commodity sitting somewhere to back it up. The US dollar is not based on any raw metal, anything at all. No more bullion-based currency, purely fiat. Now, you know, the argument against this is that this, of course, can be overwhelmingly inflationary if the government doesn't act smartly, right? And so that's putting a lot of trust in the government. Now, I will say this, by and large, the government has managed it pretty well. Meaning, how do we judge if the dollar is doing well if the bond rating agencies rate the US, our currency, as AAA plus, then we're good to go, right? Like, we're the best country in the world for bonds, or one of the best. But what determines the amount of value of a bond rating often is the amount of debt held. And if I tell you anything, what's exploded since the 70s in American history is national debt. And so actually, for the first time in the entire history of our country, Moody's, which is one of the bond rating companies, rated US down back during the Great Recession, okay? That was the very first time in history that we were downgraded as a nation and to AAA. So in other words, we're not like a, you know, we're not like a terrible risk, but you know, nonetheless, it was kind of scary to see America's bond rating get voted down. Here it is, right here. U.S. enjoys the gold standard AAA ratings. U.S. government credit rating downgrade, and the reason they downgraded our credit rating at the time was at the time when this happened, not in Nixon's time, but was that there were several congressmen that were holding public comments and saying they were not going to vote to extend the U.S. debt limit. But let me insist upon helping you understand something. If you ever hear someone say the U.S. shouldn't like raise the debt limit, The debt limit is a amount that has already been passed when they're projecting to raise it. So in other words, we've already spent that money. Now we have to give ourselves permission to spend that money, right, after the fact. So if you don't do that, then that means you have to shut down the government, because that means you've paid out more money than you have. The government has to shut down, right? And that's the kind of stuff like third world countries do, right? So that's the kind of stuff that downgrades our bond rating immediately. And that's what happened back in the 2000s. You know, you had congressmen basically threatening to vote down. And the problem is you should do that before. You should make a budget and say, you can't go past this, right? But instead, the budget comes out, they spend the money, and then they're like, oh, we have to raise the amount of money we have. It's like the credit card on your credit card balance, right? That you understand what the balance is. But imagine if the amount that you can borrow got raised, right? Does that change it? So every time the government spends too much money, they just raise the debt limit. It's called the debt ceiling, okay? So nonetheless, that's where we've gotten in recent years under this fiat currency, is the government is able to just borrow and borrow and borrow. And that's where we are today. Now, I'm not going to teach you about it today, but I will when we get to the 2000s. There is a new economic theory that has emerged. It's the economic theory that men like Senator Sanders adopt. And it's the idea that a sovereign nation, since it holds the debt, the country does, it can issue money as much as it wants. You know, it's called modern monetary theory, MMT. And so if you ever want to read up on some economics that's new, I mean, like within the last 4 years new, it's called MMT. And the advocates of MMT say, you know, the USA owes money, a lot of it, to itself. So we can decide when we pay that off. You know, we're the government. We can pass laws that say we'll pay it off whenever. We do owe some debt to foreign country, but a huge amount of our debt is held by domestic bondholders. You know, and held by, ironically, the Federal Reserve holds a lot of the U.S. debt. So, you know, so in other words, one part of the government, I know it's weird when you try to explain it to people, one part of the government has actually bought debt from another part of the government. Keep in mind, the Federal Reserve is the central bank of the United States. It's not Congress. Congress is the guys making the budget. And so they're actually holding U.S. bonds from Congress. But we still have to pay it off. You know, it's just like moving it from point A to point B. But at some point, that's going to come tricky, I think, and probably. But anyway, read MMT scholars. That's not going to be on the AP exam. But you know, if you want like the most recent sort of cutting edge argument, so the ultimate debate, like I said, would be between Keynesians. Keynesians believe that the role of government is to stimulate the economy, employ people in the public sector, you know, grow the economy that way. And free market capitalists are like, well, look at what Ayn Rand says. If a businessman makes a mistake, he suffers the consequence. I would argue that's not true in America, by the way, in a lot of businesses. You know, you may remember the bailouts of all the banks in 2007, or all the lending agencies in the 90s. So routinely we bail out companies that make bad decisions. But the argument goes, in a free market, that's the price of doing business, right? I believe we're suffering a major shift in attitude in American public schools, where it used to be you had to work to exceed, to get through, right, to pass. Now I see a whole lot of attitude about, let's just push them on through. And that means you have a nation of uneducated people, okay? But nonetheless, if you're a bureaucrat that makes a mistake, you suffer the consequences, right? Like if the government screws up, the government doesn't pay the price for it, you do, right? So I like that attitude of Rand. Although, again, I think most people who follow Rand and Milton Friedman are sort of zealots. They're like completely free market, no regulations, complete libertarians in the economy. And Keynes is not socialism writ large. So I think Keynes is more of a moderate point of view than Hayek's point of view. But it's an argument. So anyway, we had this election, and McGovern was a good guy. I mean, McGovern was a honorable, decent veteran, but he was cursed. Really, I think his whole campaign was cursed. I mentioned Shirley Chisholm the other day, and Wallace. They're going to try to run for president again. Wallace will. Shirley Chisholm is an African American from New York City. She's going to run. None of them. They're not going to get any major votes in this election. But I do want you to know a little bit about McGovern, and that is McGovern really was hoping for the youth vote, right? So he did have support from African Americans. He had support from the far left, like communists and socialists. And at least at his rallies, he had support from young people. But I think the silent America, the silent majority, looked at the group that did support him, and they're like, no way, we're not voting for this guy, right? Like, he's got hippies and commies supporting him, right? And McGovern wasn't a hippie or a commie, but he was like Eugene McCarthy, he wanted to end the war in Vietnam, like ended, like no more of this delay, like immediate withdrawal. McGovern was hoping for youth voters. He didn't get them. Less than half of all youth, like 18 to 21, who were just eligible to vote under the 26th Amendment, they didn't show up. You guys didn't show up. Like, I guess you aren't that impressed. So the point is that this is an enormous landslide for Nixon. Now, Nixon has at this time, they have been negotiating with the North Vietnamese, like negotiating an end. So that's in the election narrative that the war is coming to a close, right? Like it's not going to be. And again, he's kind of talking about peace with honor, and he's able to comfortably reach success here. You can see only Massachusetts and the District of Columbia vote for McGovern. All right, so it's a landslide. Now, one of the things that Nixon is planning to do is to continue talks with Vietnam to end the war, and he ran on the campaign of peace is at hand. But that was because we had to bomb them to the table. So Nixon is going to lift the sort of restriction on the heavy bombing of North Vietnam, and he is going to absolutely bombard North Vietnam during the 72 election year. And that will kind of stop the North Vietnamese for a little while. And then they agreed to have a negotiation. So in 1973, they're going to meet. Now, this is a slow discussion, right? The book even mentions they spend weeks over deciding who sits where at the table and what should the size of it be. It's just kind of preposterous. But he meets, here's Kissinger, and remember Kissinger is now the Secretary of State. And Kissinger is going to meet with Le Duc Tho. Ho Chi Minh is dead by now, by the way. He was old when the war started. He was never really the leader in a sense of like making decisions about the war, so much as he was kind of like the philosophical. He's kind of like I don't want to call him Gandhi figure. He's like the spiritual leader, so to speak, of the North Vietnamese movement, but not like Gandhi. Anyway, he was kind of but he had passed. And so they're going to meet in Paris, and naturally, right, where all the cool people hang out. And this is what's going to happen. Okay, they're going to negotiate the removal of U.S. forces. Okay, so we're going to leave. We're going to withdraw in 73. And by the way, this is the end of the war. This is the event. It's not a surrender. It's not a treaty. It's a treaty, but it's not like a no more fighting treaty. North Vietnam is allowed positions in South Vietnam. So they already had invaded South Vietnam some and had positions there. We hoped to and expected to have prisoner exchanges, but that wasn't a guarantee. We do get several. However, it's going to take us over a decade to get all of our POWs that we can back. So this isn't something that's immediate. And we're going to just, we're going to walk out. And this is kind of what Ho Chi Minh had predicted, that in the end, we got worn out. Now, it's during the ceasefire that we withdraw. So what does Nixon declare? Victory, right? We won. We're leaving. And as we leave, and there's a very famous, well, I'll show you in a minute. We're concerned, at least many Americans are concerned, that we might go back, right? So Congress this time, veto proof, and it does get vetoed, passes the War Powers Act. And the War Powers Act is still on the books, like today. So there are two basic rules that you have to remember with the War Powers Act. The president has to notify Congress within 48 hours of sending forces anywhere. Now, I'll be honest with you, America can get a lot done in 48 hours now. But at the time, you couldn't deploy much anywhere within 48 hours without having to notify Congress. Just try to limit some degree of what is now called the imperial presidency, meaning having presidents as commander-in-chief wage war singularly. And then more importantly, presidents cannot leave forces without congressional approval more than 90 days. So if you are going to deploy forces and you do not get Congress's support, they're not going to fund it. They don't have to. That's the War Powers Act. You're not going to go fighting a war without whose permission? Without Congress's. Now, it would have been really easy. They could have said there will be no deployment of U.S. forces without the declaration of war. But that kind of sounds harder because don't we fight all the time without declaring war? Some people wanted that. They wanted presidents particularly, to not be able to just use troops, whatever, but rather have to go to war directly. The War Powers Act and the 73 treaty did not finalize what was going to happen in Vietnam by any means. So what happens is when we pull out, and you can imagine, we've been there officially for 10 years. At the time, that was America's longest war, by the way. 10-year deployment in Vietnam, right? 10 years. By far, that has been eclipsed by the war in Afghanistan. The war in Afghanistan is now 20 years old. So, you know, we've been there for an entire generation of people who, y'all weren't even born when 9/11 happened, right? So we've had troops there longer than you've been alive. Think about that, you know. So that's coming to an end this year. So once we pulled out, the South Vietnamese, as much as they could, try to get out. That had in any way worked with us. So if you had, and of course you had to work with us because we pretty much ran South Vietnam, right? So anybody who was connected, translators, working for the government officials, they all tried to flee. And I want to point out that some of them are going to become a term that I do want you to know, which I'll put a picture of it up. And this is going to change the makeup of the American ethnicity. Okay. So you're going to have people who will literally get into, well, it says Germany. I don't want Germany. They're going to get into sampans and some of the smallest boats you might have ever seen and sail into the South Pacific. All right. And this is very similar, and it's a fair analogy to compare this to the Syrian refugees who fled to France or Italy or wherever they could get to during the Syrian civil war. So these are called, in history, we call these Vietnamese immigrants boat people. It's not a very, polite word, but the idea is they will literally go out into the water and hope to be picked up by U.S. naval vessels. And so you're going to have boat people, refugees, and people flee to Cambodia, although that's in the midst of its own civil war at the time. They'll try to get to Thailand. So any way they can to get out of the country. And you have a very famous picture in April 30th. This is the fall of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. That is literally the last American helicopter leaving the city, right? And you can see there are people trying to get on it as it is preparing. I mean, those people ain't all going to get on that chopper, right? I mean, that's obvious, right? So there were like tens of thousands of Vietnamese people who were trying to get out of South Vietnam and out of Saigon particularly. And we just kind of have to split. And so you'll see as the tanks, I should show you another picture, which I think kind of sells this just as well. One of the things I'll always remember is the U.S. pushing helicopters into the Gulf of Tonkin to make room on their deck for more people. I mean, it's crazy. Like here it is. They're pushing American helicopters over, like off the deck into the ocean to try to make room for the people fleeing from Saigon. You know, so this was rough stuff, as you might imagine. And here the communists are going to roll into Saigon and take all the building. And next thing, it's now come. So Saigon becomes Ho Chi Minh City, right? That's what it's called today. Today, Vietnam is a united country, still theoretically communist, not quite like, just like China, not really as communist as it used to be. And Vietnam unites, you know? So, I mean, you know, I don't know how else to describe this other than not a victory, you know, because A, South Vietnam becomes communist, B, Cambodia becomes communist. So we actually help incite the domino theory, tragically. And so a lot of Americans don't like to accept that. And I'm like, gosh, man, you know, we lose stuff. It happens. It's not like, you know, it's not like these people betrayed us, you know, so at least not the soldiers. Maybe you could say Kennedy and LBJ did, but, or Nixon. So look at the absolutely devastating costs of the war in Vietnam, casualties and cost. So 3 million Vietnamese killed or wounded, right? Well, killed. The wall, 58,000 dead Americans on that wall. Okay. And that was the number that just added up and added up. We just wouldn't accept it. We wouldn't stop siege. It did mean that during the guns and butter phase of Johnson's presidency, he couldn't fund as much butter because he was funding guns, right? Like you could argue he could have ended more poverty had he not had the war in Vietnam. It's that $150 billion price tag that's going to continue to grow in interest and cost of real money. And perhaps I think long-term, the most significant, in the short term, obviously, it's the lives of Americans and Vietnamese taken. But in the long term, this, coupled with Watergate, coupled with the killing of John, Bobby, and Dr. King, right? Just, it's like America's innocence and its enthusiasm. It just went, the air went out of the whole room. You know, it's like all of a sudden America was, and I think that might be why historians in your book are calling the 50s American zenith, you know, because this is definitely down from that, right? Like this is clearly a setback. And the economy goes into a setback. And then, of course, we have a political setback. But I believe, folks, I believe that we have recovered from this. Like if you think about Vietnam vets today, they are old people, you know, by all stretches of the imagination. And so you don't have to be weighed down by the twin burdens of Vietnam and Watergate. You didn't grow up with them. You have your own problems, certainly, but I think America, we have our own problems today. But anyway, I mentioned Senator McCain, and he and Senator Kerry and others are going to ultimately go back and help recover hundreds of either remains or actual POWs. Even the North Vietnamese government didn't know where a lot of these people were. But today, ultimately, and I need to double check my stats. I think this is right. There are 2,583 Americans. We don't know what happened to them. Like we don't know if they died, how they died, where they died, you know, and that's very much against America's traditional military code. But our code of military is to leave no man behind. Like that's literally how we feel. Like every soldier, sailor, Marine is valuable, and we don't leave them. So this has been something that through my life I've donated money and try to encourage people to support recovering MIAs, missing in action soldiers, MIA, and POW, prisoners of war. So in the end, Ho Chi Minh was right. You know, he said, if we have to fight, we'll fight. You will kill 10 of our men. We will kill one of yours. And it'll be, in the end, you who grows tired of it. And that is what we call a war of attrition, right? Like we just got tired of fighting. And I think both politically, but also just like psychologically, it paid a price for it. And, you know, one of the things that makes me sad about the war in Afghanistan is that you guys haven't had to deal with it at all. So you don't even think about it, right? Like I have to remind people all the time that we're at war, you know, because we're not feeling it, you know. And so I think your nation should be fully supportive of its soldiers. And by that I mean we should be, you know, holding rallies and support. That idea has gone out, you know, and I feel badly about that because I think that they feel that we don't care, and they're right. You know, a lot of soldiers are right to think that. All right, now. I will tell you this. This actually, there becomes a name for this. It's not in your textbook, but I pulled this, not because one day y'all are going to be president, right? And it is my lesson for you as a future president. It's not my lesson, by the way. This is actually a thing called the Powell Doctrine. So during the Vietnam War, there was a captain named Colin Powell. And later on, Colin Powell will be the head of the U.S. Armed Forces when we invade Iraq in 1991, right? And so this is the Powell Doctrine, what he learned from Vietnam as a field commander. You must not fight for 20 years or 10 years. Do you know how long the war Colin Powell lasted? It's awesome. The 1,000-hour war, right? Yeah, like a week. Okay, you know, more or less. It was great. We knocked out the world's 5th largest military in a week. You know, and so that's how you do it. And then we left. Wars must yield few casualties. You better believe it. Americans do not accept dead Americans, at least in the military. You know, maybe gang warfare or mass shootings, but you know, certainly not in war. Definitely something that, while I believe fully in the freedom of press, you know, if you show people war in real color in real time, they're not going to support it. I don't care who they are. If there had been media coverage of D-Day on D-Day, like live into your bedroom, that people would be like, oh my God, that's my son out there. You know, like that it changes the dynamic. You have to have the public support. And we've learned that since the War of 1812, y'all. I mean, divided wars don't turn out too well. Measurable objectives. When we wanted to defeat terrorism under President Bush, I was alarmed by that. How do you declare war on a tactic? It's like declaring war on grenades or landmines. Terrorism is a tactic. So what I wish he had done is declared war on Al-Qaeda. We can measure the destruction of Al-Qaeda, all right? Overthrowing the Taliban, we can measure that. The problem is we overthrew them and then we didn't eradicate them, so to speak, so they're back. And that's why we've been there for 20 years. Yeah, 100%. Well, I mean, there'll be like, I'm sure there'll be a base or two there or something, but there will not be ground forces committed to it. Yeah. By 9/11, 2021, President Biden says, like basically the 20th anniversary. So that's tricky, but definitely need to have a plan for how to extricate yourself. You cannot ask Americans to fight wars that are large in scale for a long time. We have a very beautiful memorial. It's interesting. The lady who designed the wall, as it's called, I don't know. Can anybody tell what it's supposed to look like physically? It's a wall made of reflective granite. It's highly polished. So it has 58,000 Americans who are killed etched into the wall. But when you're looking at it, you see yourself in it. So it's like they died for you, right? Like you're in it, so to speak, with them. But from above, it looks like this. This is Constitution Avenue over here, or Massachusetts. This is, I think, Constitution. So behind these trees to this area would be the Lincoln Memorial, like on the other side. So it's supposed to look like a scar or a wound. All right, it's supposed to look like a wound in the side. And initially, Vietnam vets didn't like it. Like they were like, "This is our memorial." She was a Vietnamese boat immigrant, a refugee, and she wanted it to look like somebody had been cut and that it was healing over. So the grass, when they planted the grass, it grew over the top. So like when you're there at the height, and by the way, when you go into the wall down at the end here, it's the first year of a casualty in the Vietnam War. I think it's like 58 or 57. A guy was killed. Eisenhower, one of his deployed advisors. And then it comes all the way down to 73 on the other side. And in the middle, which is in like 67, 8, and 9, is at the highest. And so each year represents American involvement in the war, right? So you can see it like builds up and then starts to go down. Casualties do too. But I'm very touched by it. It's a very moving, powerful memorial. Very different than what most memorials in DC look like. So I'd be familiar with that. Now, I mentioned a couple things earlier on. I'm going to have to update my notes here because I realized I have a whole lot of Watergate, but I don't have some of those other things. So let me go back here. Sorry. And let's talk about the secret bombing and invasion of Cambodia. Okay. So the U.S. invasion of Cambodia was, first of all, secret, right? Nixon did this in 70. Then he makes it public when we send ground forces in it. But he started with the bombing of Cambodia. Now, obviously, it's not secret once you see him holding press conferences, right? But once it became, this is the thing that prompted what response, y'all? Anybody remember a protest or two that responded? Not Berkeley. That was, much earlier, free speech movement. It's okay. Kent State. Okay. So the Kent State, where the shooting was at Kent State, and at Jackson State as well. So if you look at this, I'd be curious to think, what happens when a government is trying to govern its country and in its border over here, it's being bombed and invaded. Well, what that does is it creates a destabilization of the Cambodian government. Okay, Cambodia had a monarchy that was relatively successful, but up in the northern mountains of Cambodia, you had a group called the Khmer Rouge, Khmer Rouge. That stands for literally Red Cambodian. Okay, so Khmer Cambodia, which they called Kampuchea back then, and Rouge Red. So these were communists, and they had been, not very successful. But once we started invading and bombing Cambodia, that destabilized the government. The Cambodian people were unhappy that in their country they were getting bombed, by someone else. And what that did is gave more fuel for the Khmer Rouge. They got more supporters, and then they invaded Phnom Penh and overthrew the government and set up a communist government in Cambodia. Now, we didn't expect that, I guess, initially, but our bombing and invasion of Cambodia destabilized Cambodia. It got so bad. Now, during this period, I wanted y'all to see these pictures. In fact, I think I should shrink Mr. Nixon here and raise this bottom picture. This is an example of an earthen dam where corpses washed up in Cambodia. A third of the entire population of Cambodia were killed by this government. It's called the killing fields. They massacred teachers, journalists, anyone who had worked with the West, anyone who understood anything. They started the calendar over at year 0. They killed, so they could brand. This often happens with revolutions. The French did it. The French Revolution. Yeah, you're right. Like brand new year, brand new everything. Yeah, right. That's right. So the Cambodians are forced into these massive collective farms to grow rice. The cities are empty, and around these farms are landmines. They say there's a landmine for every Cambodian. They're still there. A lot of Cambodians are in danger of landmines now. Princess Diana, I don't know if y'all remember the British princess or not, but her last sort of public mission was to try to ban the use of landmines, right? And so if you build landmines around a concentration camp, you don't have to build fences. You don't have to have yards. I mean, guards, because people wander out and they get blown up, right? But they were killing thousands of people. The Khmer Rouge gets overthrown by the Vietnamese communists. They come in there so many Cambodians were fleeing to Vietnam or to Thailand that the Vietnamese invaded after the Vietnam War to stop this going on. And so one group of communists in Vietnam stopped the communists in Cambodia. That's how ridiculous it got. So I would definitely be familiar with this, what happened in Cambodia. And of course, President Nixon lied for a good chunk of that before finally telling us about it. Now, I've shown you the War Powers Act. I will mention Congress had tried to limit his power earlier. If you're doing the reading, you'll remember that you'll learn that Nixon vetoes a bill that had passed he vetoes it was called the Cooper Church Amendment in 71, which would have basically ended the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. So if you come across the Cooper Church, that's the two foreign relations leaders. That was in 71. But consider the War Powers Act in 73, he can't be he's got a veto-proof vote in Congress. They're very unhappy with him, because what the Cooper Church Amendment wanted was not to let the president could not just do whatever he wanted to with the military, like go invade a country, and call that as part of the war. Now, yeah, it was connected to the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but this was a destabilizing event, really. Okay.
What did he say? We weren't bombing?
He initially denied it, even while the bombing, and then he announced it in 70. So he goes from lying to not lying, But by that point, it was already public knowledge that this was happening. What I'm saying? Thanks for the late update. So yeah, I would know the Khmer Rouge. That was the result of this. Okay, the Khmer Rouge came in. Okay, this is a guy's book about Pol Pot, but I'll put it up here. I'll type it for you. That'd be the best. Khmer Rouge, they call themselves Angka, like the government, but the name of the kind of group was Red Cambodia or Khmer Rouge. Sorry. Khmer Rouge. And they're one of the worst, both dictatorships, but also just brutal regimes of torture and murder. And one of the most horrifying things about the Khmer Rouge is they actually used children to do a lot of the murder. They ended the family as a construct. They broke, so in other words, when you had children, they became wards of the state. They weren't your children, they were the people's children. And the children would then be brainwashed, indoctrinated that, all the stuff that was, and then they actually have, I've seen the pictures of it. They would have these blue trash bags, and they would wrap them around adult heads who were tied up, and they would smother them to death. They would kill them. So this actually went on for 2 years. And it was just terrible. My mom has been to Cambodia in recent years to help the Cambodian people, help get clean drinking water. They need water filtration just in the countryside. We take that kind of stuff for granted, but big deal. Okay. Now, President Nixon is going to identify what he calls new isolationism. Okay. It's not really, I think the debate is, are we going to be unilateral, which is in the past, you guys know unilateral? It means one-sided, America, one side, unilateral, like we do it and, not really ask other. Are we going to be multilateral? Are we going to genuinely be isolationist, which means head in the sand, not paying attention? Or are we going to be non-interventionist, which means we kind of get along with the rest of the world, but we don't interact with violently with them, But nonetheless, what Nixon argues as part of the Nixon doctrine and new isolationism is that we're going to be much more cautious in the use of American forces. So restraint. We're not going to comfortable. It's basically the antithesis of what Kennedy said when he said we'll pay any price and bear any burden. We're like, nah, we're probably not going to do that. We're not going to pay any price or bear every burden. So he's kind of saying, okay, we might be done in these foreign excursions for a while. Now, a good example of one is Israel, because we don't send troops to Israel, but we definitely help Israel. So Israel is going to get a bailout, so to speak, from us in the middle of the Yom Kippur War. So if you don't know anything about it, Israel is going to have routinely get attacked by its neighbors, right? Starting in 48 on its birthday, but we've talked about the 6-Day War, I think, and then we definitely mentioned the Suez Crisis, which that's the Israelis attack. So this is another one of these uprisings, so to speak, intifadas. And at the time, the Palestinians were angry over the 6-Day War losses. They lost Gaza, they lost the Golan Heights, and the West Bank. Gosh, that's a big thing to lose. So there is a terrorist group. Now, I will mention there is an overarching organization coordinating the Palestinian resistance to Israel, and it's called the PLO. And the PLO sponsors, among others, terrorist groups, what we would call terrorists. And the actions that the Black September does here in Munich, Germany, is a terrorist act. So Black September is one of these Palestinian terrorist groups. And they come to Germany. Now, Germany in 72 is West Germany. It is enormously successful. It's had a great recovery. It's very excited. The last time Germany had hosted the Olympics, they were the Nazi Olympics in 36. So they kind of want to get a fresh start on that, And they had this beautiful Olympic village. They were like nice townhouses and stuff. And that's where the Olympic athletes stayed. And one night during the opening of the Olympics, the first couple of weeks of the Olympics, a group of armed mercenaries smashed through the door of the Israeli Olympic apartments. And they take the Israeli, I think it's like the wrestlers and some of the track and field team, they take them prisoner. Some are killed in the initial exchange. All right. And then those athletes are then taken by the Palestinians to a helicopter, right? The Germans try to rescue them like a raid, like a secret raid kind of thing. It ends in a shootout, and the helicopters with the men get blown up, and all the Israelis get killed and Palestinians. So this was a terrible moment. And at the time, Israel had a brand new prime minister, relatively new. She was an extraordinary lady. She's from America. I think she's from Minnesota. But when Israel was formed, lots of Jewish people around the world moved to Israel, including from America. And her name is Golda Meir. And when the Arabs attacked Israel and the Yom Kippur is a holiday, when they attacked, they didn't have enough money. And Nixon's going to float with Kissinger billions in aid to the Israelis, including American weapon systems and American military. And so this moment is going to be one of those moments where the Arabs clearly recognize who's not on their side is America, right? And so it comes out of this period. Combine this with, if you go back into the 60s, we had routinely helped Israel financially. So by 72, the Arab world is like, clear. It's very clear that we don't like them. We keep siding with Israel. And so Nixon does openly back Golda Meir. He also is supportive of Israel developing their nuclear arsenal during the 70s. So it's during 1970s that Israel will get its first nuke. Meir will task the Israeli secret police, the Mossad, with hunting down the terrorists of Black September, and they catch every one of them and either kill them or bring them to Israel for justice. This is also the period when they catch Eichmann, who is the planner of the Holocaust, who was living in Argentina. So this is when Israel begins to become very muscular, very strong, powerful country. And a lot of it looks like American weapons with Israeli handlers, Israeli people. So I would be familiar with this because this is going to prompt a response to us from the West, from the East. So you may recall there had been a cartel created back in the 50s, to kind of get the world's oil countries together, right? So, and after we do this, and after we are, kind of not being very cooperative that they see with our ramping up of production, OPEC is going to put the West under an embargo. So the US, Britain, France, we're all going to be on a massive embargo from the world, the vast majority of the world's oil producing countries, right? And so we do not have nearly enough oil to provide for the demands of the American economy in the 70s. And this is some of my earliest childhood memories, is having to wait in line for your special license plate number. Back then they had a personalized plate, so it was like letter or number. But on these days, your license plates could get gas. So it was rationing, and it was being done not by the government, but by the, and you guys may have run into a little bit of this at your family with when the toilet paper was running low at the beginning of the pandemic, right? So this was a period where I remember being with my uncle up in Northern Virginia, and they used these things. They hung out signs with flags, and so OPEC embargoed, America, and man, it just added to our inflationary woes. This was a really crippling moment. We're going to respond with a couple things. First of all, we're like, all right, we need to kind of form our own version of OPEC, or at very least, some sort of group that is able to offset OPEC's strength, right? And so we're going to create the International Energy Agency. And this is for the countries that aren't in OPEC that are capable of producing oil or our buddies. So the International Atomic Energy Agency, oh man, sorry, let me do that. And you can see down there at the bottom in light blue is Israel, and of course Australia, and perhaps most notably at least that time in history, we're also going to create a national speed limit at 55 miles an hour to conserve oil consumption. Okay, so these are the agencies of the International Energy Agency, which is our response, and a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit on the nation's highways. So what impact does all that have on our economy? Well, it quadruples the price of gas, and it never goes back down. I'm not kidding. When you looked at old gas prices, so if I pull up a gas price from 1961, all right, let's see if I can find a graphic. Yeah, that's not it. Here, that's it. So here's a gas price in 1961 at Exxon, which was then called Esso. So it used to cost that. That's 24 cents a gallon. Nice, right? So this is where it's going to quadruple after this. The $2, $1.90, and then of course it's been up above that for a long time, but kind of close to that ever since. Now our oil dependency has tripled by the end of the war, World War II, and the amount of cars increased. I also want you to consider the types of cars, right? So let me show you a couple cars to help you understand why it was very clear that we were not at all concerned about fuel economy. All right. So like a 1957 Chevy, which is one of my favorites. I love it. My dad used to have one. That sucker is built out of steel, right? And I'm curious, is anybody can guess the fuel efficiency of a 1957 Chevy? No, I'm sure. Miles per gallon, MPG, right? Not a picture. So it was, how many miles per gallon does a 57 Chevy get? I'm 13.9 average miles per gallon. What'd you say? 12. Okay. Well, that's highway. So, maybe. So 14, under 14 miles per gallon, right? So that's okay if you don't need, to worry about the price of gas, right? Or if you look at a 1961, let's go to a 67 Camaro, 1967. How about that? So these cars, or I should do the 66 Mustang, the two cars I've owned, or my family's owned, 1966 Ford Mustang, which was a piece of art. I mean, it is a craft piece, right? Yeah, it's gorgeous. Fastback. Sorry, I'm distracted. This is one we had, 66. Yeah, well, I love it. I mean, these are great, beautiful cars, but it had a V8, 289, and it got probably about 14 miles a gallon on a good day. All right. So if you look at these vehicles, I mean, they're magnificent, they're beautiful, but they're unbelievably inefficient when it came to fuel efficiency, right? So if you think about the 70s cars, they're going to get a whole lot smaller. All right. I think it's really fascinating today to see kind of like the thumb you know, say screw you to the fuel efficiency people when you see these massive trucks. But sometimes I read that these massive trucks are like electric. I'm like, what? Yeah, so we'll see. Anyway, we're gonna have to shift away from this. Does anybody know what a 1976 Honda looks like? 1976 Honda. Let's see if that was. Yeah, there it is. The Honda Civic. So look at that a little bit. So this thing probably had at least twice, if not three times, the amount of fuel efficiency of that Ford Mustang. Right. So we're going to go with smaller cars. Right. And that's going to lead to things like the Ford Pinto. Right. Which is like the 1906 Ford Pinto is basically the best that America could come up with version of a Honda. All right, so take a look at that. The Ford Pinto, right? So that was like, we hadn't been making cars like this. We were making cars that were fat beasts, you know, that were awesome. GTOs and stuff. Who wants to make that? All right, but you know, the reality is America is bigger and thus better. No. So recognize the oil crisis starts in the 70s. Right? It's called the oil crisis. And wow, let's get to Watergate. Yep. So, whoa, we got 4 minutes left. Watergate? No, I can't do Watergate in 4 minutes. All right. So we'll do Watergate tomorrow, and that's everything up to Watergate. And so tomorrow, that is the Watergate right there. By the way. My mom worked in this hotel. It's a hotel. You know, it's still a hotel. It's right on the Potomac River. That's the Potomac. And that big compound in it, that massive place, was the home of the Democratic National Committee. So you know how like their parties, well, the parties have, you know, like offices somewhere, and the offices of the Democratic National Committee were in this office building. Okay, there's a hotel and office complex, and that's where we'll pick up tomorrow. Lots of off the different stuff here. All right. Anything I need to help? Do I not have Watergate on y'all's